I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, and a chill running through my body that I couldn't shake. It was one of those strange, almost dreamlike moments where you know something is wrong but can't figure out exactly what it is. My eyes flickered open and the room felt off. Everything was still, unnaturally quiet, except for the faint creak of the floorboards under my feet, echoing in the silence. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the grogginess from my head. I was alone in my room. At least, I thought I was. The soft glow from the streetlight outside filtered in through the thin curtains, casting shadows across the walls. It was a familiar, almost comforting sight. Yet tonight, it felt different. I sat up in bed, trying to steady my breath, my eyes scanning the room. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the minutes, but something about the sound felt distorted, like a distant echo. That's when I saw it. The window, the one directly across from my bed, was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing it before going to sleep. It wasn't a huge gap, but enough for a cold draft to slip through, sending a shiver down my spine. My thoughts raced. Could it have been the wind? Or had I forgotten to close it? I told myself it was nothing. It was late, and I was just tired. But then I noticed something strange. There, just beyond the glass, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a shadow cast by the tree outside. But then the figure moved. I froze, staring, unable to breathe. My chest felt tight, like something was pressing down on me, forcing the air out of my lungs. The figure stood completely still, as if it were watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the dim light of the street outside. But I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart was hammering now, each beat louder than the last. I knew I had to do something, but my body refused to cooperate. My legs felt numb, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. I needed to call someone, anyone. But as I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, I noticed something even worse. The figure at the window was no longer standing still. It was slowly moving towards the glass, its face just inches from the window pane. I could see the outline of its features now. Pale skin, hollow eyes, lips parted in a grim smile. And that's when I realized something else. The figure wasn't alone. I could make out more shapes behind it, faint and indistinct, like shadows clinging to the darkness, just barely visible. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced for an explanation, but there was none. Nothing made sense. How could this be happening? Was I dreaming? No. This felt too real. Then, the figure at the window pressed its hand against the glass. I could see the outline of its fingers, long and thin, leaving greasy smudges on the surface. My heart skipped a beat as it slowly turned its head towards me. I could see it now, its face almost pressed against the window, eyes wide and unblinking. A low, rasping breath seemed to come from the other side of the glass, fogging it up for a brief moment. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my body locked in place, my gaze fixed on the thing outside. Then, it did something that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. It smiled. Not a friendly smile, not even a normal smile. It was a twisted, grotesque grin, stretching across its face in an unnatural way. My body shook violently as it leaned in closer, its breath fogging the window once again. I could hear it now, a faint whisper coming from the other side, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Let me in." I I couldn't respond, couldn't speak, couldn't move. I wanted to run, to lock the window, to hide under the covers, but my body was frozen. All I could do was stare, helpless and terrified, as the figure's smile grew wider. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and the darkness outside the window deepened. And as I watched the figure, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something far worse was coming. I don't know how long I sat there, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I don't know how I finally found the strength to move, but when I did, I bolted out of bed and ran to the door. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, my legs weak and trembling. I thought I was safe, but then I looked back at my window. The figure was gone. I never did find out who or what that thing was. But it didn't end that night. It never did. I stood there outside, heart racing, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The cold night air felt like a shock to my system, but it didn't comfort me. I looked back at the window one more time, half expecting to see the figure still there, watching me from the shadows. But the window was empty, just as it had been before. I told myself that it was over, that it was just my imagination, a trick my mind played on me in the dead of night. I tried to steady myself, to convince myself that nothing had happened, that I was safe now. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was lurking in the dark, waiting, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still there, somewhere in the house. Maybe it had never left. I slowly made my way back inside, keeping my eyes glued to the window. My fingers gripped the door frame as I stepped into the house, my pulse still racing. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold a presence that I couldn't see. I felt like I was being followed, like something was just behind me, breathing down my neck. I went straight to the living room, my eyes darting around every corner. The house was silent, eerily so, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. I had to be sure. I had to know that nothing could get in. But then, a noise, a soft, scraping sound coming from upstairs. I froze, my blood running cold. I didn't want to go upstairs. I didn't want to investigate. But something urged me forward. Something in my gut told me that I had to know what was happening. With each step, the noise grew louder, closer. A dragging sound, like something heavy, was being pulled across the floor. My stomach churned. I tried to steady my breathing, but it felt like my heart was going to burst from my chest. I reached the bottom of the stairs. The house was dark, only the faintest glow from the streetlight outside filtering in through the curtains. But the noise, it was unmistakable. It was coming from the attic. I didn't want to go up there. The attic had always given me a sense of unease. It was dark, cramped, filled with old things I never touched. But tonight felt different. I grabbed the nearest flashlight and made my way up the stairs, every step creaking under my weight. My palms were sweaty, my legs shaky, but I had no choice. I had to know what was up there. As I reached the top of the stairs, the scraping sound stopped. Silence. But the air felt thick, heavy, like something was waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed the attic door open. The hinges groaned in protest, and I flinched at the sound. The flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating piles of old boxes and dusty furniture. But there was something else, a shape, hunched in the far corner of the room. It was crouching low, barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat, my breath hitching in my throat. I raised the flashlight, the beam landing directly on it. The figure. It was the same one, the same twisted face, the same hollow eyes, the same grotesque grin stretched across its face. But now it wasn't outside my window. It was inside the house, and it was closer than ever. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. The figure turned its head slowly, deliberately, its eyes meeting mine. "Let me in." The whisper echoed through my mind, sending chills down my spine. It was no longer outside the window. It was inside my house, and it knew I was here. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a stack of old boxes. My mind raced, desperately trying to find an escape, a way out, but there was nothing. The figure didn't move. It didn't approach me. It just stood there, staring, watching. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, like smoke drifting away in the wind, leaving nothing behind but a lingering sense of dread. I stood frozen in place, not knowing what to do, how to process what had just happened. Was it real? Was I going crazy? My head spun with questions, each one more terrifying than the last. But as I turned to leave, a sound stopped me cold. A whisper, faint but clear, coming from the shadows. "Don't go." I spun around, but the attic was empty. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't know what was happening. All I knew was that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The figure had come into my house. It had followed me, watched me, and I didn't know what it wanted. But I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over. The night dragged on, and I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure. Its hollow eyes, that wicked smile. It was as though it had carved itself into my mind, a permanent fixture that refused to let go. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a hallucination, some trick of the mind brought on by the stress and exhaustion of the past few weeks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every sound in the house made my heart leap into my throat. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains sent me into a frenzy. I couldn't sit still. I couldn't relax. I couldn't even leave the house. It was as if the very walls were closing in on me, trapping me in a nightmare with no escape. At some point, I started to hear things, whispers, faint at first, barely audible, but as the days passed, they grew louder. I would hear them at night when the house was completely silent. It was as if someone was standing just behind me, breathing softly in my ear. "Let me in." The whisper would come from nowhere, surrounding me, filling the room with an oppressive, suffocating presence. And then, just as suddenly, it would vanish. The silence would return, but it was no longer comforting. It was terrifying. I tried to leave the house, hoping that a change of scenery would help clear my head. But every time I stepped outside, I felt it, the eyes watching me. I would glance around, half expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't feel safe anywhere. Days turned into weeks, and the figure didn't leave. It never left me alone. Every night, it was there, at the window, in the shadows, lurking just beyond my sight. Every time I thought it was gone, it would return, and the whispers never stopped. It was as if it was trying to communicate with me, to make me listen. But what did it want? It tried to do everything I could to stop it. I locked the doors. I drew the blinds. I even set up cameras in every room, hoping to catch something, anything, that would give me a clue as to what was happening. But every time I reviewed the footage, there was nothing. The house was always empty. No figure, no movement. And yet, I knew it was there. One night, as I sat in my living room, staring at the blinking light of my security camera feed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft knock, 3 sharp raps on the door. I froze, the blood draining from my face. It wasn't just the knock that terrified me. It was the timing. I had set the security system to alert me to any motion outside the door. The camera should have picked up the presence of anyone standing there. But it hadn't. There was no one on the feed. I slowly approached the door, heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. I had to know. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, the seconds stretching into infinity. But then the knock came again. Louder this time, more insistent. The handle rattled. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. I had no idea what was waiting on the other side, but I wasn't about to find out. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. That was when I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't outside the door. It was inside. I turned, my eyes frantically scanning the room. The shadow wasn't a trick of the light. It was solid, moving, creeping along the walls as if it were alive. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the figure again. It was standing there, just behind me, its twisted form barely visible in the dim light. It was closer now, far too close. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. I spun around, expecting to face it head on, but the moment I did, it was gone. I gasped for air, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't live like this. I couldn't stay in this house, constantly looking over my shoulder, constantly feeling like I was being hunted. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but as I did, I noticed something strange. My screen was filled with notifications, messages from numbers I didn't recognize. I opened one. "You forgot something." My heart stopped. The message was chilling. My hands trembled as I scrolled down, looking at the other messages. They were all the same. "You forgot something." I scrolled back to the top of the list, my finger freezing as I saw the timestamp on the first message, 3:14 a.m., the time I had been asleep. I ran to the kitchen, my mind racing. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear my own thoughts. I grabbed my phone again, checking the camera roll. There, at the very top, was a new picture. A picture of me, asleep, taken from the foot of my bed. I wasn't alone. As I stared at the picture on my phone, my breath caught in my throat. I had no memory of this moment. The photo was taken in the dark, and I was lying in my bed, completely unaware of what was happening around me. But the chilling detail. There was a figure standing at the edge of my bed, its face barely visible, but unmistakably human. I felt my stomach turn. This wasn't a joke or a bad dream. This was real. I looked around the room, but it was silent. Everything seemed normal, too normal. I tried to convince myself it was some sort of mistake. Maybe my phone had glitched, or I had taken the picture without realizing. But I knew deep down it wasn't that simple. The knocking on the door started again. Soft, hesitant knocks, just enough to get my attention. I froze. This wasn't just in my head. Someone was out there. My heart pounded in my chest. The knocking stopped, but I could feel something else. A presence, like someone or something was waiting. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone again and looked at the time. It was 3:14 a.m. I couldn't breathe. Why was I awake at this hour? Why was I so aware of everything around me, but at the same time paralyzed? I stood up slowly, my legs shaky beneath me. My heart was hammering in my ears, but I tried to stay calm. I reached for the door, the one I was sure was locked, and the handle turned. I stumbled back, terrified. The door opened on its own, creaking loudly in the silence of the house. Standing there in the doorway, well, no one, just empty space. But I could feel it. Something was watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I grabbed the nearest thing, my keys, and hurried out of the room, making my way to the front door. My body was stiff, my legs refusing to move faster, but I kept going. When I opened the door, there was no one in sight. The street was dark and still. I rushed outside, feeling the cold air bite at my skin. That's when I looked down. There, lying on the ground right in front of me, was my phone. I picked it up and unlocked it. And there, in the latest photo, taken just moments ago, was me, standing outside, but in the reflection of the glass door, there was a shadow behind me. It wasn't my reflection. The figure was still there. I could barely make myself breathe. I had never been so certain of my surroundings before. Every night, I'd fall asleep in the comfort of my own bed, in my own house, thinking everything was fine. But one night, everything changed. It wasn't that I had a bad feeling, or that there was anything unusual leading up to it. That night was like any other. I had spent the day working and felt exhausted. So when I went to bed, it was a relief to finally close my eyes and let the darkness take over. The house was still, so still that you could hear the faint creaking of the floorboards, the occasional hum of the refrigerator in the next room. But I had a feeling, not a strong one, just something small at the back of my mind, almost as though someone was watching me. At first, I brushed it off. It's just my imagination, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But then, as I drifted into a deep sleep, I was jolted awake by the feeling that something wasn't right. The room felt colder. The air was thick, like it was pressing in on me. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I just lay there, paralyzed by an inexplicable sense of dread. That's when I saw it. A shadow, standing in the corner of my room. It wasn't clear at first, just a dark shape blending in with the darkness of the night. I tried to blink the grogginess out of my eyes, but the shadow didn't move. It stood perfectly still, almost like it was waiting for me to notice. My heart pounded in my chest. I was certain it was my mind playing tricks on me. It's just a trick of the light, I whispered to myself. It has to be. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the shadow remained. I slowly shifted, trying to ease my body out of the bed without making a sound. I was scared to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the shadow. But this time, it wasn't alone. I saw movement. The shadow, now clearly a figure, was standing there, staring at me. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with an intensity that froze me in place. The figure didn't say anything. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with those unnerving eyes. I tried to scream, to do anything to break the paralysis that had taken hold of me, but my throat was tight and no sound escaped. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The figure didn't budge. It was as though time itself had stopped, and all that was left was me and this strange presence in the room. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. 1 second it was there, and the next, there was nothing but darkness. I quickly turned on the bedside lamp, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The room looked the same as it always had, yet it felt different. The air was no longer thick with tension, but something was still off. I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that it was just a bad dream. But the unease lingered. The thought of that figure, those eyes, haunted me for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep after that. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept the light on, too scared to even close my eyes. The next morning, when the sun had risen and the world seemed safe again, I tried to put the experience out of my mind. After all, I had to go to work. I had responsibilities, and life couldn't stop for fear. But as I went about my day, something nagged at the back of my mind. I hadn't imagined it. The figure hadn't been a dream. I didn't know how I knew, but I just knew. A few days later, it happened again. I woke up in the middle of the night to that same sense of dread. The air was cold, the silence suffocating, but this time I was ready. I had my phone next to me, ready to record whatever was happening. I wasn't going to let myself doubt my sanity again. I slowly turned my head, and there it was, the figure, standing in the same spot as before. The same unblinking stare, the same haunting presence. I felt the same chill run down my spine, but this time I held up my phone and began recording. As soon as I hit the record button, the figure moved. Slowly, almost fluidly, it stepped closer to my bed, its eyes never leaving mine. My heart raced in my chest, but I stayed still, too terrified to do anything else. The figure stopped right at the edge of my bed, its cold gaze piercing through me. For a moment, it just stood there, and then it spoke. "You shouldn't have recorded me." The voice was low, guttural, and almost familiar. I couldn't place it, but it felt like something I had heard before, like a distant memory I couldn't reach. My breath caught in my throat. Then the figure vanished, just like that. Gone. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to get out of that house. I don't know if it was the fear or something else, but I couldn't stay there anymore. The house felt like a prison, and I was its captive. I packed a bag and left that same morning, heading to a friend's place. I needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. It's been months since that night, and I still don't know what I saw, or who, or what was in my room. I tried to show the video to a few friends, but they couldn't hear the voice. They couldn't see the figure. It was as if the video had captured only the moments before it disappeared. No one believed me, but I know what I saw, and to this day, every time I lie down to sleep, I still feel that unease, like someone is watching me. That feeling has never fully gone away. The worst part? I never went back to that house, and I never will. I think about the figure sometimes, about that haunting stare. I try to rationalize it, but something inside me knows. What happened that night was real. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. I don't know if it will ever come back, but part of me wonders, what if it's still out there, watching me, waiting? The days after I left the house were unsettling, to say the least. It was like I was living in two worlds, one where everything was normal, and another where something was out there, lingering just beyond the edge of my perception. Every time I would close my eyes, I would feel that heavy, suffocating sensation, like someone was standing just behind me, watching my every move. I tried to keep myself busy, to distract myself from the feeling that something was following me. I stayed with friends, went out to places I enjoyed, and tried to live my life as normally as possible. But every night, the same unease would return. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness would feel oppressive, and the silence would be deafening, like the world had paused just to make room for that feeling of dread. I couldn't shake the memory of the figure standing at the edge of my bed, staring at me with those hollow eyes. I even went to a therapist, hoping they could help me make sense of it all. I told them everything: the figure, the voice, the feeling that I wasn't alone, even when I was surrounded by people. The therapist was kind, and while they didn't dismiss my experience outright, they suggested that it might be a result of stress, maybe a manifestation of anxiety. But I knew deep down that it wasn't just stress. What I experienced was real, and it wasn't something my mind had created. Weeks turned into months, and I tried to move on. I found a new place to live, a small apartment in a different neighborhood, far from the house that had once been my home. It was a fresh start, or so I thought. But no matter how far I moved, no matter how many new places I tried to make my own, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still out there, waiting, watching. Then, one night, I received an unexpected message. It was from an unknown number. The message was simple, just a single sentence. You should never have left. My heart skipped a beat. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Who was this? How did they know what had happened? How did they know that I had left? The message didn't make sense, but the chill that ran down my spine was all too familiar. It was the same feeling I had when I first woke up to that figure in my room. The same suffocating fear, the same realization that something was following me, something that I couldn't escape. I tried to block the number, but the messages kept coming. At all hours of the day and night, I would receive new messages, each one more cryptic than the last. You'll never be free. It's not over. I see you. The messages were always short, but each one made my skin crawl. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go back to the house I had left behind in such a hurry. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening, why this was happening. Maybe if I faced it head on, I could finally put an end to it. I stood in front of the house that had once been my home, the place where everything changed. It looked the same as it had when I left, quiet, abandoned, almost like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I knew the truth. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The house was dark and cold, just as I remembered it. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the silence. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, like a voice calling my name. I froze. The whisper grew louder, clearer, until it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a voice, unmistakable and real. It was the same voice I had heard that night, the same voice that had spoken to me from the figure in my room. You shouldn't have come back. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, my eyes searching the darkness, but there was no one there, just the shadows, stretching long across the walls. But I could feel it. I could feel them, watching, waiting. The figure was here, in the house with me, just as it had been that night. I ran, my breath coming in short gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know what I was looking for. I just needed to get out, to escape before it was too late. But the house wouldn't let me go. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how many doors I opened, the walls seemed to shift, to close in around me. The house had become a labyrinth, a twisted version of reality where the rules no longer applied. The air was suffocating, and the shadows seemed to follow me, stretching out to grab me. Finally, I made it to the front door, only to find it locked. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was sealed shut. And then I saw it, the figure standing in the doorway. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was the same figure, the same cold, unblinking eyes. It was as though it had been waiting for me all along, waiting for me to come back, to face it. And as I stared into its eyes, I realized something. I wasn't just running from it. I was running from myself. The figure wasn't just a stranger. It was a reflection of everything I had been trying to avoid. My fears, my regrets, my guilt. They were all wrapped up in this thing, this presence that had haunted me for so long. It wasn't just in the house. It was in me. I knew in that moment that I couldn't escape it. I couldn't outrun it. With a final, desperate effort, I reached out and touched the figure. And as soon as I did, everything stopped. The house was silent. The air cleared. The shadows receded. And I realized that the figure, the voice, the fear, it had all been a part of me all along. I wasn't running from something outside. I was running from the truth inside me. I left the house for good that day, but I didn't leave empty-handed. I left with the knowledge that I had to face my own darkness in order to move on. I don't know if the figure will ever come back, but I know now that it doesn't matter, because the scariest thing wasn't the figure in the house. It was the truth I had been avoiding. And that truth is not something you can outrun. It's something you have to face head on. As I stood there, facing the figure in that eerie, abandoned house, I felt my entire body freeze in place. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. The figure wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was me, or rather, it was everything I had been avoiding in my life. The guilt, the shame, the unresolved emotions, and the fears I had buried so deep within myself had manifested into something tangible, something that had haunted me for months. The house seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter as the weight of my own fears became too much to bear. The shadows stretched out, reaching for me as if they were trying to pull me into a deeper abyss of my own making. But in that moment, something shifted. The fear, though still there, didn't consume me as it once had. I stood still, taking a long, deep breath, and let it wash over me. The figure, myself, didn't move. It only stared at me with those hollow eyes, as if waiting for me to understand. I reached out again, trembling, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of understanding, an acceptance that I couldn't continue running from what I had done or what I had become. The moment my hand made contact with the figure, a strange calm washed over me. The shadows receded, and the house, which had once seemed alive with dread, became just a house again. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, just breathing and feeling the weight of everything lift off me. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't an instant fix. But in that moment, I felt something shift within me, like a long-held breath finally released. When I stepped out of the house, I felt different, lighter perhaps. The burden I had carried for so long was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I knew I wasn't free from it entirely, but I had taken the first step in facing it, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the possibility of moving forward. That night, as I lay in my new apartment, the messages from the unknown number stopped. The voice, the figure, the haunting presence, they didn't return. It was as if they had vanished with the understanding I had gained in that house. I don't know if the figure was real or if it was all a manifestation of my mind. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that I faced it. I faced the darkness within me and confronted the truth I had been running from. And in doing so, I found the strength to move on. Now, as I look back, I realize something I never understood before. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the monsters that chase us or the ghosts that haunt us. It's the truths we bury deep inside, the fears we refuse to face. But once we confront them, once we stop running, we can finally start to heal. And though I may never know what truly happened that night, one thing is for certain. I'll never run from the darkness again. Not because it's gone, but because I now know how to face it. I woke up in the dead of night, the sound of my breath too loud in the silence of my room. At first, I thought it was just a dream, the kind that makes you feel uneasy even after you wake up. But when I opened my eyes, something felt wrong. It was dark, and I couldn't see much, but I felt a presence in the room with me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, my heartbeat picking up as I strained my eyes to adjust to the dim light. The curtains, which I always kept tightly drawn, swayed slightly, as if someone had just been standing there. I turned my head, hoping to reassure myself that I was alone, but then I saw it. There, in the far corner of my room, a figure stood. The shape was so dark it blended into the shadows, barely distinguishable from the walls, but I could make out the outline of a person, a man. My body went rigid with terror, and I felt a rush of panic flooding my chest. I blinked hard, hoping I was just imagining it. But no, the figure didn't disappear. I froze, holding my breath, praying that I was just hallucinating, or still in a half-asleep state. But then the figure moved, just a little, like he was adjusting his stance. My heart pounded so hard in my chest, I thought it might explode. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, the words getting caught in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't even scream. I could feel the weight of his gaze, as if he knew I was awake, as if he was waiting for me to realize he was there. My body refused to move. It was as though I was paralyzed, trapped in my own bed, unable to run or scream. I didn't know what to do. Was this a burglar? A prank? Or was it something far worse? The longer I stared at the figure, the more real it seemed. I wasn't sure how long we stood there, but it felt like an eternity. The tension in the room grew unbearable, the air thick with fear. Every second, the shadows around the man seemed to grow darker, more menacing. Then, as if he had been standing there for hours, the man slowly started to take a step forward. My pulse raced, and I instinctively pulled the blankets tighter around myself, hoping to shield me from whatever was coming. But it didn't matter. He moved closer, step by step, as if he knew I couldn't escape. My mind screamed at me to act, to fight, to run, but I couldn't. I was too terrified to even think. The man reached the foot of my bed, and I could feel the chill emanating from him. My breath hitched in my throat as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Who was he? Why was he here? I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost in my throat. I was trapped in some nightmare, unable to wake myself up. Then, just as he stood right beside me, something strange happened. The air grew even colder, and the figure, who had been standing so still, watching me, suddenly moved away. I saw him step back slowly until he was just standing at the edge of the room again, his dark outline blending into the shadows. I didn't dare look away, not even for a second. The fear in me was so strong I couldn't even blink. And then, in a whisper so quiet I could barely hear it, the man spoke. "Sleep tight." The words sent a wave of terror crashing over me. They weren't loud, but they were clear, and they felt like a warning, like some twisted promise that he would be back. And just like that, he was gone. I didn't hear the door open, didn't hear footsteps, nothing. The room was silent, except for the frantic beating of my heart. I lay there, trembling in my bed, unsure of what had just happened. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body was still frozen, too shocked to react. I stayed awake all night, every creak of the house, every gust of wind making my heart race. In the morning, I checked every corner of my room, every window, every door. There was no sign of anyone having entered, no sign of forced entry. I had no proof that someone had been there, no physical evidence of the man, but I knew what I had seen. The worst part? It wasn't just the man watching me. It was the way he had spoken, the way his words felt like a cold hand gripping my heart. The next few nights were the same. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, feeling the same presence in the room with me. Every time I opened my eyes, I'd see that figure in the corner, watching, waiting. But this time, I was ready. I made sure my phone was within reach, and I decided that if it happened again, I'd take a picture. I needed proof. And so, it did. The third night, I woke up to that same chilling sensation, and sure enough, there he was, standing in the corner of my room. This time, I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I unlocked it. The light of the screen illuminated the room, and when I looked back up, the man was still there, staring at me with those cold, hollow eyes. I took a quick picture, not daring to move any closer, just hoping the camera would capture what I was seeing. But when I looked at the photo, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was no one in the corner, no figure, no shadow, no man, just the empty room. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if I was truly being haunted. But as I sat there, staring at the empty room, I couldn't help but wonder, had I really seen him, or had I just imagined it all? Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for me to finally accept that I wasn't alone in that room. And now, Every night, I still wake up, checking the corners, my heart racing as I wait to see if he's back. But no matter what I do, the feeling never leaves. The man may be gone, but his presence still lingers. Maybe he's not just watching me. Maybe he's waiting for me to make my next move. And sometimes I wonder if the next time I close my eyes, it might be the last time I wake up.